So I thought I'd make a video of the inside of a Sequential Circuits Pro 1 in case some of you guys haven't noticed how cool this thing really is. There's all kinds of little Easter eggs on here. Here's a few. That silk screened onto the board. Not too shabby. Really unique. And same with this guy, except this is actual solder. It's on there. And it looks like some engineers have written out tolerances on some of what I assume to be tuning. And you see signatures from some of the QA engineers. It's really fun to think back in the day Sequential Circuits was in business and making cutting edge sense and coming out with a Prophet 5 and a Pro 1, and back in its heyday when this was one of the desirable scents. One of the engineers had signed off this thing by hand. So one of those guys to touch this themselves, yep, that's good. So it feels like a little bit of history already. A little more Easter egg stuff. Here's that. Yeah. Girlfriend says that that's Sanskrit. And something you might notice on this board, and get a light, is the traces seem to kind of snake around at random. You see all that? This synthesizer was made back in the day when these boards were transitioning from being hand-drawn by engineers to going through computer-aided design, or CAD, to build the circuit boards that we're familiar with today, with right angles and, you know, basically just kind of an optimized board everywhere. But there's no reason why you can't just draw the circuit yourself if you're able to pay attention and get it right. Especially if you have a very specific board layout in mind, like on a synthesizer where the pots, they need to be a certain place. So, you know, you have a lot of playing room, like here's some empty spots, here's some empty spots. The goal really isn't to make it as small as possible, which is common in a lot of today's electronics. And the funny thing is, in the right angles, the reason why they were right angles, and still are right angles, but mostly by tradition, is that back in the day, the computers that would compute these paths, it took a lot of computation to figure out what the optimal path is. So to ease on the computers, the logic used right angles, sometimes 45-degree angles, which is really fancy. That's actually more common today, to kind of salvage some of that computation required. Because if you were to figure out a completely perfect tight path, and you ended up with traces like these with curves, it would be like extremely difficult on the CPUs in the 80s to produce something like this. So if you had engineers that knew what they were doing, then you can actually produce a better board by hand at the time by just drawing it yourself instead of running it through a computer. And that's exactly how this board was made. So this pot right here, well, I should just say this is a pot. This is a pot. The pots have a really interesting construction, as the tops of these things look to be like they are fiberglass of some type. So if you wanted, you can take this thing apart pretty easily, and just 4 tabs. Of course, you'd have to desolder it and stuff, and they're quite large, I must say. These black guys right here, if you are familiar with the Pro 1, these are the octaves on the 2 oscillators. So these guys click, where these guys just spin freely. And this is actually the reason why I took it apart. These pots have their resistive strip. They've kind of oxidized up a little bit, so when I turn it, you hear and since everything's analog, it's not compensated by a computer, so you really hear it. Here is the logic for the sequencer. This is a 40-note sequencer on this thing, which back in the day was actually pretty impressive for a synthesizer like this. Bear in mind, this was the early 80s, so RAM was very expensive. That's one of the reasons why Macintosh was so popular back in the day, because it came with gobs of RAM, which, I mean, we're talking like, you know, what was it, like, I think it was like a 128K or something like that, which was enormous at the time. A lot of computers would have much less than that. So the fact that this had a sequencer that it would store in memory using RAM was kind of a big deal, and it was a good selling feature of the synth. They're also able to keep the price down on this thing, which was very attractive. So let's flip this thing over and see what's on the back of it. More of the same. Very snaky signal paths. It's fun to see the electrolytic capacitors like this just kind of hanging on the board. No reason why you couldn't, but something that's unique to this is there's no adhesive like you would see on a board today to hold big caps like this from hanging around and possibly snapping off. They just kind of sit there. And you can also see the real snaky traces by the engineers who drew this thing out by hand. I mean, really, look at that. It's borderline artistic. I would say it is artistic. Well, I mean, there's like Buddhas in Sanskrit on the other side. Who the hell am I to prove it is artistic? So, more writing. This writing actually looks pretty new, so this could have been written by somebody who was servicing the synth. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, look at that. Randomly drawn. Well, more than randomly, but you know. Here's a real interesting trace. Traces. Yeah. This dip socket is actually for the keyboard, which I would also really like to show you. The keyboard on this thing is really cool. It's not too unusual for the time, but unless you are looking to find something like this, hold on, let me get my light, then you may not even ever know this exists. These days, if you get a keyboard, it usually comes with a membrane dome on the keys, or you get something fancy or whatever, but membrane's really common. The Juno 106 had it. This is that dip socket. Really interesting. It's on the end of a ribbon cable. But anyway, going more into the rubber dome stuff, look at this. When I first saw this, it blew my mind. So there is a keyboard matrix. The keyboard matrix is just a way of getting all the keys on this keyboard into a small number of wires like this. So it scans keys section at a time, which is extremely common. These days you pretty much will never see a keyboard that does not have it. And even back then with the Pro 1 it still had it, so you get the idea. It's only like in the early 70s that you would really see one wire per key, and like the cables on these things would be thick. So there's a great advantage to scanning the keyboard instead. And one of the ways to do that, just in a nutshell, is to use diodes, so there's no crosstalk on the keys. So when you're scanning sections, you know that a key is a part of a section. There's a technical reason why, but I won't get into the details. If you're curious, you can look up keyboard matrices on Google or what have you. But yeah, I just told you to Google it. So this is what's so cool about this keyboard. Watch, there's that hanging wire, and then there's a thick wire on the bottom, the common one. And as I press this key, you can see this wire actually hit that thing. This is what triggers the note. Every key has this. Isn't that wild? Hit that black key. Yeah, so if you wanted to get really obsessive compulsive with tuning this keyboard and servicing it and making it up to snuff, then you can grab one of these guys gently, as it's just rubber, and pull it out or push it in so that the keys actuate at about half depth or whatever you prefer. You can actually get choosy. But when you play this thing, you'll hear the tapping sound. Now you know what that is. That's the sound of this wire knocking on that common guy there. So one of the things you can do while you're servicing it is to take a Q-tip, give it some rubbing alcohol or some contact cleaner or whatever, just spray it on the Q-tip and gently just kind of rub it along these guys. But unless it's in really bad shape, you really don't need to clean these things, as they kind of self-maintain themselves. Let's look at this one more time. I'll show you why that is. Try to get the angle right. I'm wearing a headlamp. There, that kind of works. Okay. Focus. There we go. So notice it taps, but then when you press, it's like a little spring. So as it does this, it actually scrapes it just slightly. So it's kind of self-cleaning, like, since it has that angle and that kind of scraping action, as you play, it kind of cleans itself, which is kind of nice. I mean, clean itself, yeah, because it wears, but it's not going to wear out. So yeah, that's the keyboard on this bad boy. Let's take a look at some other angles. So here's the springs. You can see that they chose different colors for the black keys and the white keys to have different tensions. One of the things I wanted to do while I have this open as well, these keys are kind of chunky, so I thought I would throw just a little bit of grease on there to clean them up. Yeah, so take the key out, you would pull the spring out, and then the key just comes off. Of course, you will have to readjust these guys. So, oh look, I might be able to just put some grease in there instead. That'd be nice. Little details. Guess I could show you the modulation and pitch wheel. This synthesizer is kind of unique in that the pitch wheel does not have a spring on it. It just kind of goes up or down and it stays. However, there is this tab that centers it, so you can kind of center it. It stops. Yeah, the modulation wheel is just free. And they're on these pots. It goes to this connector, which goes to the board. The Pro 1 was actually criticized a little bit for a cheap construction, and I actually agree. I think this thing is kind of made sort of cheap compared to like the Prophet 5 or something, which the Pro 1 was aiming to be a one oscillator version of the Pro 5. So you get a Pro 5 sound in a monophonic package. Is very attractive. But yeah, it was kind of cheap. You can kind of see that this is just plastic and it's not thick or anything. It's kind of wobbly. it is kind of cheap. However, it does have a lot of character and the sound is great. These are the wood pieces on the side. This is original. It hasn't been restained or anything. The two screws come off, and it's essential to taking this thing apart. Oh, and in addition, you do need to take all the pots off to take the motherboard out. Yeah, which they pop off. The pots on these things have little metal tabs on the inside. Focus, camera. Oh. Yeah, they got little metal tabs. So they hold in pretty well. Yeah, so that's about it. Sequential Circuits Pro 1 with very cool designs on the motherboard. Yeah, well, sweet. Thanks for watching. Hope you found this interesting.